Good morning, church. It's good to see everyone. That was a beautiful song, Nathan. Thank you for choosing that as the song coming into the lesson. We're in this series on First Peter, and kind of a recap of where we've come to so far is Peter is writing to Gentile Christians, but he's using Jewish language, and he calls them exiles. He calls them the diaspora, or as the ESV says, the dispersion. And what he's trying to say is, as Israel were exiles from Israel, as the Jews were exiles from Israel, you as Christians are exiles from where? Heaven. And what he's getting at is your citizenship matters. Where you're from shapes how you live life today. And so he's driving home this point all throughout his letter. He's saying, remember your citizenship. Remember who you are. You are God's chosen. You're God's elect. And this world is going to treat you in different ways. This world is not going to be kind to you, but remember that Christ suffered and died, and so therefore you will suffer. And many of you right now are thinking, I'm suffering now. It is so cold in here. And if you're online and you want to feel more like you're with us, drop your temperature to about 60. It's cold in the gym this morning, so I see some of you bundling up. We'll suffer together. But Peter is writing to people who are suffering, and he's reminding them that when you suffer, remember who you are and where you're from. Because there's three responses that are bad that you can give to suffering. Three responses that are tempting. That first, you can assimilate. You say, okay, if I'm suffering, I need to look more like the culture I'm in. If I look more like the culture I'm in, I'll be accepted and I won't have to suffer. Or you can withdraw completely. You can hide away from the world, and if they can't find you, they can't persecute you. So it's build higher and thicker walls to keep the world out so that we don't have to suffer. The third bad way that we've talked about is fight back. And Peter's going to talk about this, that fighting back to a world that persecutes you is not the way of Christ. That if you give insult when you are insulted, you're going to suffer because of your actions, not because of the love that you show the world. And so he looks to Christ and says, okay, Christ suffered, come and be like Christ. And so I want to begin our lesson this morning with looking at Peter for a second. And in Mark chapter 8, 27 through 38, we're reading this letter from Peter, and we gotta put Peter back in his context in the Gospels. And so you have Mark chapter 8, 27 through 38. It says, Jesus and his disciples went on to the village around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, Jesus asked them, who do people say that I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets. Jesus looked at them and said, but what about you? Who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. I want you to keep that in your mind. Peter looks at Jesus and says, I've got the answer. You are the Messiah, the chosen one, the one sent by God to redeem Israel. You are the one we've been waiting for. You are our hope in the flesh. You are the Messiah. And then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of God must suffer. He must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And then he must be killed, but after 3 days he'll rise again. And I love when the gospel writers say this. They say, he spoke plainly about this. He didn't give a parable. He didn't give them metaphor. He said, this plainly is what is going to happen. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die, and I'm going to be raised from the dead. And then it says, Peter took him aside, said, now Jesus, come here. Let me tell you who you're supposed to be as the Messiah. He took him off screen even. For those of you that are watching online. He took Jesus off to the side and said, now listen, that's not who the Messiah is supposed to be. Let me tell you who you're supposed to be. And then Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, and he rebuked Peter. And he says, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then he called the crowd together along with the disciples, and he said, whoever, again, he's speaking plainly. So don't try and read between the lines. Just hear what Jesus is saying. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life for the sake of me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in the Father's glory and with the holy angels. So I want you to think about Peter in this position. He finally, in all these things that Peter says wrong, he finally gets it right. You are the Messiah. And then when he says, okay, this is what the Messiah is going to look like, this is what the Messiah is going to have to do, Peter says, no, that's not the Messiah you are. And so what Peter has within himself, and I want you to feel this tension in Peter and feel it in yourself, Peter has conflicting stories, conflicting narratives, conflicting views in his life, that Peter looks at the Messiah and says, power and dominance is what is going to save us. And Jesus says, I'm going to die. I'm going to suffer. This is the only way. And so when you see this tension in Peter that he's saying, no, the Messiah is supposed to come in with a sword to drive Rome out and to establish God's kingdom and to make Israel the great place it is supposed to be. When God comes in with the Messiah, he's going to come in and he's going to kick Roman tail. Jesus says, I'm going to go to them. I'm going to let them do their worst to me. Because the only way to transform this world is not through having a bigger stick, but through having a bigger heart. To allow the world to do its worst and to love them to the cross and back. And so he has this conflict, and you see this conflict in Peter playing out in his letter to the churches. That when he calls them to live a certain way, he says, remember the salvation you had. This is looking back over the last few weeks. Remember the salvation you have. That this relationship with God through the Holy Spirit is so great that the prophets, they just would have died to know what you know. And the angels are jealous and long to understand what you understand about God. And then because of that, you live a holy and pure life because Jesus has called you out of darkness and into the light. And when you know that your citizenship is in heaven, you don't feel the need to fight for your citizenship here. And so when we come into conflict with the world, we quickly remember, my citizenship is not in this place. It's kept in heaven for me. And this citizenship in heaven, we taste, as we talked about last week, we taste that the Lord is good. And when you taste that the Lord is good, you crave God more than anything else. And what Peter said in our text last week was, don't become drunk with the world, be sober with the Lord so that you can see the direction that you need to go. He says, when you live into the kingdom that God has called you into, we're in chapter 2, verse 9, and we're getting into this morning's text. He says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a holy people of his own possession. You are God's beloved. And one of the things Peter's going to talk about, and we're going to talk more about this next week, is when you're rejected by the world, you remember that you have family. When you become marginalized in society, you kind of people who are marginalized kind of form their own special group, that they are accepted because they're all equally marginalized. And so when you as a Christian recognize your place and your citizenship is actually in heaven, this becomes your family. And he uses familial language. He uses the language of family to describe the church in a way that says, when you no longer have the world, when you lose everything, you gain the one thing that matters, family. And we're going to talk more about this next week. When I think about power and the struggle of this world, I'm constantly wrestling with how do we have healthy discourse between people who don't think alike? How do you get the Christian, the Buddhist, the Muslim, the atheist, how do you get them together and have a healthy discourse? How do you get a Democrat and a Republican to sit at a table together and to talk about what's good for the nation without fighting? And the reality is, when we don't have any place for that. We don't have places for people to disagree, and it seems as though our nation is getting more and more volatile. Our culture is becoming more and more outraged. And when you think about, okay, well, who's outraged? It's always the other group that's outraged. And they're the ones that are being immature, and they're the ones that aren't acting the way they should. But the reality is, we're all outraged all the time over everything. Even over what you eat because of who's on the box or who, everybody gets outraged over everything. And I found a lecture by a guy named Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist, and he was having a discussion with Timothy Keller, who's a pastor and a theologian and an apologist. And they had this beautiful discussion at NYU, which is not a place that normally has good discussions. But they had this discussion about how do we create a society where people can actually have good public discourse. And I want to share with you something Timothy Keller said about the power struggles in our nation that actually have led to why we don't have good discourse. Because I think this will actually help us understand where we are as Christians in this nation and how we need to respond to it. So he talks about the history of our country, and this is a very brief and a very pointed history, that when we think about morality in our country, for the first bit of time, it was the Protestant churches, the Episcopals, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists, who established morality for our culture. And he says that if you are a Catholic or a Jew, you're okay, but you're kind of strange in this society. This is way back. If you're a Protestant, you're okay. If you're a Catholic or Jew, you're acceptable. But if you're an atheist or secular or gay, you have no place in society. You're beyond the pale. And then that group kind of lost power in the 60s and 70s. They came on the decline. And at the end of the 70s, you had the white evangelical churches, what was called the moral majority, stepped into the power void at this point. And they played some of the same game where they said, here is the morality of the country. And they set the standard for morality. And his whole point with this is there is no room for discussion. If you didn't hold the line, you were ostracized in society. And this is an oversimplification of history, and he goes on to say that in the last 10 to 15 years, what you see is the liberal left gaining more power. And so what you have in society today is a culture war between who is going to control the morality of our culture. Okay, is everybody kind of with me? Do you feel that? And the way you define a culture war is a cultural conflict between social groups and the struggle for dominance of their values, beliefs, and practices. And what this pastor, Timothy Keller, was actually lamenting is what the world needs is a place to have healthy dialogue. And as long as there's one group that is jockeying for position of power and saying, we are the ones who determine morality, everyone else will be ostracized and marginalized. And so what we have in culture today is a group that says, if you don't think like us, act like us, believe like us, you are not acceptable. Okay, do you feel that? And you can think back over the last 10 to 15 years. I think back to where I was in high school and where things are today. It's not been 15 years, by the way. But I think about what's changed in the world, and you see where that power structure, that fight for power has been happening. And so the position that we find ourselves in as Christians is, how are we going to respond when we're no longer in power? And this is why Peter is so important. He says, don't assimilate. Because if you don't want to be persecuted by the dominating culture, assimilate. But that's not the proper response of a Christian. And he says, now don't withdraw from the world, stay engaged in the world. The third temptation that's bad is to then fight back. And we have people in our country on both sides that it feels like, I may be too cynical, but it feels like there's people on both sides that are ready to take up arms against the other side. Is everybody else feeling that? And the temptation is to fight back to gain power, but Peter is telling us that is not the way of Christ. And so we come to the passage that we're in. When you find yourself being marginalized by society, recognize that your citizenship is in heaven. Your citizenship is Christian first. All other identities come second. In chapter 2, verse 11, he says, beloved. And when you hear beloved, hear God's chosen people, those with whom God loves. He says, I urge you as sojourners, as exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. It says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. Keep your conduct amongst the pagans, amongst the citizens of this world. Keep your conduct honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of his visitation. And that's the passage I really want to focus on. So I'm going to come back around to it because I want to look at this next section where he talks about be subject. He's talking about submission. Be subject. Verse 13, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Well, what if that human institution is oppressive? Submit yourself. Well, what if they don't have the same belief system I do? Submit yourself. Because when he's writing this, he's talking about Domitian. He's talking about, Domitian was the emperor at the time. He's talking about Nero, who lit Rome on fire and blamed the Christians. He says, submit, give honor. These are the people who are dragging Christians into the Colosseum and killing them and making them fight lions. And Peter says, submit. Now, they didn't get to vote in the Roman Empire. Go vote. But submit if you don't like the outcome. And if you're a Republican, you are welcome here. If you are a Democrat, you are welcome here. If you do not vote, you are welcome here. If you're not an American, you are welcome here. Because this is not America. This is the church. And the church has to do things differently. And so as a church, we submit, we actually submit to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or governors who are sent by them to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God. So hear this. This is the will of God, that by your submission, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. By your submission, the way that you live your life, the way that you give honor to people that you disagree with, you silence the foolish and ignorant talk of others. He says this, live as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. What he's saying here, and this is the key verse, that live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they will be found foolish in their accusations against you. And there's this weird section, starting in verse 18. I'm going to gloss over this because we just have too much to cover. But he then says, slaves or servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to those who are unjust. And then he skips down to chapter 3, verse 1, says, likewise, wives, be subject to your husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of the wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. And this is a weird passage, because then he goes on to say, and husbands, show respect. It is wildly unbalanced. When you go and read the household codes of Paul, there's a balance of those who have power and those who do not. Those who are in authority, he says, masters, be good to your subjects, be good to your slaves, be good to your servants. Servants, be good to your masters. And he puts a balance there. But in Peter, he's only talking to those who are without power. And the point here I want to make is this, and I think this is Peter's point. When you become a Christian, you do not disrupt the social fabric of the world. Becoming a Christian does not make you a worse wife. Becoming a Christian does not make you a worse husband. Becoming a Christian does not make you a worse slave. If anything, and this is primary, becoming a Christian makes you a better worker. That in your jobs, let's bring this to more modern times, because if we start getting into the slaves and like the patriarchal system of the old world and all that, we're going to miss the point. And when we only read this for women not having braided hair, we miss the point. What this is getting at is this: when you become a follower of Christ, you recognize that your place in this world is established by Christ alone, and your value comes from Christ alone. And no matter who your boss is, and no matter how they treat you, they're going to see Jesus in you by the way that you work. So if you work at Snap-on Tools, or if you used to work on Snap-on Tools, you be the best employee you can be. And when they say, okay, everybody else is slacking off, why do you work so hard, Greg? Not anymore, but you used to work hard. Why do you work so hard? Because my citizenship is in heaven, and this is what Christ did to serve the world. Christ submitted himself in such a way that he made the world better everywhere he went. And so when you want to be a good Christian, you've got to be a good employee where you are. And when you want to show the world what it looks like to be Christ, women, if you're married to a man who's not a Christian, you be even better as a wife to show your husband what it looks like to be Christ. And what Peter's getting at in all of this, in this whole section, what Peter's getting at is you live the gospel in such a way that the world sees Jesus. So if you're marginalized in society and you don't like what's going on, how do you respond to it? You give honor. When you don't like a ruling that the judges have made, when you don't like something that's going on, how do you respond to people? Through love. If you don't like what someone posted on Facebook, what do? Do you get on and start blasting them and calling them idiots? And sorry, you shouldn't say idiots. But you don't get on and start bad-mouthing people. What do? You show them love. You look at the way of Christ, and you pick up your cross and you follow him. It troubles me to watch Christians enter into public discourse not showing honor. Honor to who? Anyone. And the way that we look at this is we come back to this passage at the beginning that says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they're going to glorify God on the day that he comes. That we look at the quote from St. Francis of Assisi says, go everywhere preaching the good news. When necessary, use words. And what he's saying is everywhere you go, you just ooze the love of Christ in such a way that people want to know, why are you so different? And next week, we're going to get to that verse that says, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have, which implies people are asking the question. They see the way you live your life and they say, why are you so different? The whole world is in chaos. Why are you at peace? And you just simply respond, I care how this election turns out. I honestly do. But at the end of the day, this is all grass. This is all flowers. It's going to wither and fade. And the only thing that continues is the Word of God. So why am I at peace when the whole world is chaotic? Because Jesus Christ is Lord. He's got this. And us entering into anger and chaos is a way of us holding on to the world that makes us drunk and blind to God's control. And when the world is angry, what do they say about Christians? They say, man, the Christians I know in my life are the most peaceful and calm and loving people I've ever met. But the reality is, we're not known for that. Christians are known for being judgmental, for being too political, for being hypocritical, and for being anti-gay. When you read the book, there's a book called Unchristian that came out it's a really boring book, but it's great research on how the world views Christianity. And when they surveyed the country, that's what we were known for, were those things. And so what does it look like to turn the image of Christianity back to Christ? And I look to the Sermon on the Mount as a model, and I just want to hear the echoes of the Sermon on the Mount in this. I would love it if when people thought about Christianity, when they thought about Christians, they would say stuff like, you might love Christians or you might hate Christians, but all the people in the world, they're the least angry people I know. Jesus says, how's your anger? Okay, you haven't murdered anyone today, but how's your anger? And if we're following the way of Christ, are we the least angry people in the world? And they may say stuff like, you might love Christians or hate Christians, but of all the people in the world I know, Christians have the deepest integrity. Their yes means yes, their no means no. You know, you might love Christians or you might hate Christians, but of all the people I know in the world, Christians are the ones who will never quit loving you, even when you give them every reason to. They will love you even when you become their enemy. You hear the echoes of Jesus in that. And we remember that when Jesus got on the cross, he just cleared out the temple. And we like to go to the righteous anger of Jesus and say, okay, Jesus cleared the temple, so I have a right to be angry too. And, you know, anger is a natural emotion, but what do you do with that anger? Because Jesus, while he cleared the temple, then went straight to the cross and died for the same people that put him there. So what does it mean to pick up your cross and to follow Jesus? And the temptation of Peter's context is to withdraw, to assimilate, or to fight back. But Peter is calling us to live such good lives among the pagans that our lifestyle is so radically different from the world that they see Christ in everything we do. And people may love or they may hate and reject Jesus, but they will never reject Jesus because of his people. And that's one of the things that breaks my heart the most right now is atheists and agnostics and non-Christians I talk to, or people who were formerly Christians, they left Christ, they left the church because of how we act. Because we're so quick to condemn and so quick to judge and so quick to be angry and so quick to be filled with hatred. And so, church, I just want to end with this. You are a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation. You're a people of his own possession. And he says, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the pagans honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they're going to see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he comes. And so when we call on Jesus as Messiah, which Messiah is it that we're calling on? Do we want the Messiah who who wields a sword like Peter wanted, or do we want a Messiah that we follow to the cross? And then when we've lost everything, we know that we have the one thing that matters most, the family of God with him as our Father. And so as we prepare for communion, Nathan, I want to call you to come and lead us in song.